Bloodline of the Gods. Written by Nick Redfern, narrated by Michael Lee, 111. Chapter 13. The Arrival of the Abductors. The accounts of both Truman Bethurum and Antonio Vilas Boas were reported quite widely in UFO-themed books, magazines, and newsletters in decades past. It was, however, the overtly sexual nature of the claims that led many researchers of the UFO phenomenon to ignore or completely write off the cases as fanciful tales born out of fantasy, wishful thinking, and not a lot else. That situation changed post-September 19, 1961. That was the night when what is widely considered to be a downright historic UFO encounter occurred. It was nowhere near as sexually driven as Vilas Boas' case, but it did have an important human reproductive angle to it. This was something that undeniably set the scene for what followed later, namely extensive research suggesting that an alien-human breeding program not only existed millennia ago but continues to exist, despite the apparent exit of the Anunnaki, or the vast majority of them thousands of years ago. If the Anunnaki did ultimately leave our world for their ill-fated, degrading home planet, then how precisely might just such a program be continued without their ongoing presence? As noted earlier, there is a distinct possibility the Anunnaki may have left behind them a veritable army of what we might call biological drones. Caretakers created, crafted, and programmed to perform specific tasks, including overseeing a long-term genetic manipulation of humankind, while their godlike overlords remain absent from view. The aforementioned date of September 19, 1961, specifically that night, was when a New Hampshire husband and wife, Barney and Betty Hill, were driving to their New Hampshire home after taking a welcome vacation in Montreal, Canada. One might argue they needed another vacation after experiencing what was lurking and looming on the horizon. Kidnappers from above. As the pair headed home, and at around 10:30 p.m., as they drove south of Lancaster, New Hampshire, they were puzzled by the sight of a strange light in the night sky above. Viewing the lighted object through binoculars convinced the Hills that what they were seeing was not an aircraft of either a commercial or military kind. As they continued their drive through the mountains, Barney and Betty developed an uneasy sense that whatever was flying the craft was specifically watching them, playing a game with them, toying with them, and practically goading them into following the maneuvers of the mysterious vehicle. Matters came to a sudden hair-raising head when the object approached their car and dropped to a height of around 90 feet, causing a terrified Barney to bring the car to a sudden stop in the middle of the road on the darkened mountain pass. Pancake-like was how Barney later described the unearthly-looking vehicle after stepping out of the car and staring into the dark skies. As Barney focused on the craft with binoculars, he couldn't fail to see close to a dozen beings wearing caps, milling around and peering down at the now deeply frightened pair. When the machine began to close in on the Hills' car, Barney shouted to Betty that the things inside were going to kidnap them. They jumped back into the car and sped off at high speed, which is hardly surprising. Craft and crew did not follow, or so it seemed at the time. Hypnosis, buried memories, and probing for pregnancy. The traumatic encounter was far from over. It didn't take long at all before Betty and Barney realized that there was something very wrong about their journey. About 2 hours of time was missing from it, gone, obliterated from their memories. Finally, after nightmares, restless nights of tossing and turning and picking up on fragmented memories, suggesting that there was more to the incident than they consciously remembered, the pair received help from a psychiatrist and neurologist in Boston, Massachusetts, Dr. Benjamin Simon, began a series of hypnotic sessions with the Hills in January of 1964. What surfaced out of those sessions while Barney and Betty were rendered into altered states by the doctor was, to put it bluntly, astounding. If the results of the hypnosis were not the product of fantasy or suggestion, both of the Hills had been taken aboard what was nothing less than an alien spacecraft and subjected to a number of medical procedures that clearly left Betty and Barney in states of lasting turmoil. One of those procedures, specifically performed on Betty, gave an indication that human reproduction somehow played a role in the matter. And something that Barney reported, it will soon be revealed, has a major bearing on the Rh-negative issue. The modern era of alien abductions and that attendant matter of a connection to human reproduction and an alien bloodline was about to be born. The story is a remarkable one, and one that is comprised of Betty's and Barney's own memories that flooded back into their mind during distressing dreams, as well as data that surfaced during the hypnosis sessions with Dr. Simon. We'll start with Betty. According to Betty, while under the control and sway of the strange creatures that stood before her on the craft, she experienced something deeply traumatic. Laid out flat on something similar to an operating table, Betty, to her horror, witnessed one of the entities inserting a needle device into her navel. After informing her he was going to check if she was pregnant, in addition, Betty said the alien performing the procedure assured her that the test would be very helpful, but in what way and why exactly were not explained. Nor was it explained who the procedure would be helpful for, Betty or the ETs. One suspects the latter. According to Betty, the needle was somewhere between 4 and 6 inches in length and had a tube attached to it. Far from feeling like the slight discomfort associated with a regular medical needle, however, Betty said that the pain, as it was inserted, was more along the lines of what she thought it would feel like to have the blade of a knife plunged into her. In other words, it was excruciating. Both the entity carrying out the task and an additional one that was perceived by the Hills as the leader reacted in a surprised and concerned fashion, to the extent that the creature overseeing the situation waved his hands across Betty's eyes, something that immediately removed all of the agony. At least that was the scenario in Betty's dreams. Under hypnosis, however, the story was that the pain did not go away. Betty was still in pain and deeply stressed. This is highly suggestive of the probability that her subconscious state had attempted to place a more positive and far less traumatic slant on the experience, but one that the hypnosis sessions demonstrated was far worse than her mind was trying to tell her. In fact, such was the stressful, pain-filled, and fear-dominated state that Betty was in, Dr. Simon took the immediate step of bringing the hypnotic session to a rapid halt. This particular aspect of the Hill affair brings us to the matter of something called amniocentesis, an alien equivalent of amniocentesis. When a woman becomes pregnant, the developing fetus is enveloped in what is termed amniotic fluid. It is a liquid that is very much like water, and from a study of which a great deal can be ascertained about the health and development of the fetus, alpha-fetoprotein and developing skin cells are two of the main things that the amniocentesis procedures focuses on, as it seeks to confirm the condition of the fetus. During the process, a needle is inserted into the mother's uterus via her abdomen, usually between 15 and 18 weeks into the pregnancy. Because the procedure can at times be a tricky one, it is constantly overseen via ultrasound scanning. The goal is to use the needle to secure a small amount of amniotic fluid, which can then be studied and analyzed. Typically, the procedure is performed for genetic reasons, such as to determine if the developing baby may have muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, or Down syndrome. It's a procedure which is very often undertaken on women in their mid-30s or older, and who have a remarkably higher chance of developing chromosomal disorders, and those who have given birth to a previous child with either physical or mental disorders. It may not be a coincidence that when Betty was subjected to that curious procedure, she was already in her early 40s. Rather notably, one of the risks associated with amniocentesis is directly connected to the matter of the Rh negatives. During the process of utilizing a needle to secure skin cells and alpha-fetoprotein from the fetus, blood cells from the baby may enter the bloodstream of the mother. If mother and baby have the same blood, there is no problem. If, however, the mother is Rh negative and the child is not, Rh sensitization will occur, and the mother's body will immediately begin creating antibodies to attack the fetus's blood cells. Only by giving the mother the drug Rh immunoglobulin can the baby be free of attack from its very own parent. Amniocentesis or something else? It must be said that there is one notable difference between amniocentesis and the procedure that Betty Hill experienced, namely that the needle inserted into Betty went via her navel. In amniocentesis, it's via the abdomen and then into the uterus. Nevertheless, it's still astonishing that Betty's aliens informed her that the needle inserting procedure was linked with determining if she was pregnant. Those doubtful of Betty's account might take note of the fact that in 1930, the team of Leland E. Hawley, Thomas Orville Denise, and J. Duane Miller performed an amniocentesis procedure on a pregnant woman. In this case, it involved injecting dye into the amniotic sac. specifically to study the placenta and the fetus. It was also used as far back as 1950s to determine if an Rh-negative woman was carrying an Rh-negative baby. It was, however, a procedure that remained extremely dicey until the early 1970s, when the introduction of the ultrasound technology was applied to the process of securing alpha-fetoprotein and skin cells. Could Betty have heard of or read about these early pre-1960s era examples of amniocentesis? Certainly it's not impossible. In addition, in 1960, only 1 year before the encounter of the Hills, and for the very first time, amniocentesis was used to identify hemophilia-related issues relative to mother and fetus. It was a development reported on at the same time through primarily in the pages of in-house medical journals of a type that Betty was unlikely to have come across. If Betty did have an awareness of what amniocentesis is, it's not impossible that buried memories of reading about it had a bearing on both her dream-based and hypnotic recollections. But, on the other hand, why would Betty say the needle was inserted into her navel if she knew that amniocentesis was a technique that was focused only on the abdomen and the uterus? In some respects, what Betty told of sounds far more like a laparoscopy, in which a small insertion is made into the belly and a lighted tube is inserted to allow for an examination of the pelvic organs to be undertaken. Given that the pelvic organs include the uterus, the fallopian tubes, the vagina, and the ovaries, a solid case can still be made that the procedure performed on Betty was specifically of a gynecological nature, even if it wasn't a case of amniocentesis. The strange story of Barney's spine. Having addressed one of the most significant procedures performed on Betty Hill, let's take a look at two experiences reported by her husband, Barney, both of which have a bearing on the overall story that this book tells. At one point, while Barney was being medically examined, one of the entities placed something over his penis that caused him to orgasm and ejaculate. The inference is that the aliens wished to obtain a sample of Barney's sperm. There then followed a much stronger procedure. One of the creatures carefully ran its fingers down the entire length of Barney's spine. So carefully and precisely was the action taken. Barney came to suspect the alien was counting how many vertebrae Barney had. This might sound odd at first glance. Upon taking a second look, however, there may have been a very good reason for performing a task that many might find downright peculiar or even unnecessary. About 1 in 10 of the world's population is born with an extra sixth lumbar vertebrae. What is particularly interesting, however, is that the percentage of Rh negatives with an additional vertebrae is significant. With this in mind, one could make a logical assumption that the alien in question was trying to determine if Barney was Rh negative. It's also worth noting that although most people associate the experience of the Hills with the so-called diminutive, skinny, hairless, large-headed, and black-eyed grays of alien abduction lore, the fact is that Betty described the entities as having dark hair, pronounced foreheads, and large noses that reminded her of the nose of Jimmy Durant. For those who are not aware of who Durant was, he was an Italian-American comedian noted for his huge nose. Interestingly, a careful look at Durant's nose reveals it was not at all dissimilar to that of the Neanderthals, who are part and parcel of the Rh-negative controversy. The pronounced foreheads, as described by Betty, were also typical of the Neanderthals, as almost certainly was the dark hair she described them as having. Should we consider that the aliens encountered by Barney and Betty Hill late one night in September 1961 had a lineage extending back to the days of the Cro-Magnons, the Neanderthals, and the DNA manipulating Anunnaki? Maybe yes. Barney Hill died in 1969. He was only 46 years of age. Betty lived on until 2004, when she passed on at a ripe old age of 85. As a result, many aspects of the Hills case elude us and are likely to continue to do so. It should, however, be kept firmly in the mind that 1. A procedure was performed on Betty that was not unlike amniocentesis, which, as we have seen, can have a bearing on issues concerning an Rh-negative pregnant woman carrying an Rh-positive fetus. And 2, steps were taken to count Barney's lumbar vertebrae, something that may well be related to the matter of many Rh negatives having an extra vertebrae. Many investigators of the UFO phenomenon perceive the Hill case as one of the most important cases on record, from a historical perspective and from the angle of it being the first high-profile example of alien abduction. The incident may also be significant from the undeniable, but until now largely unappreciated, connection to the domain of the Rh negatives. And that will conclude this reading.